The Duke of Stirling did not die in a bed of white linen, surrounded by weeping relatives and the frantic prayers of a court physician. He died in the chair that had become his fortress, a high-backed seat of ox-blood leather that faced a window overlooking the grey, churning sea beyond the rugged cliffs of the estate. The room was Stirling Hall's inner sanctum, a study that tasted of beeswax, old parchment, and the sharp salt spray that breached the ancient stone walls during the autumn gales. Arthur Vane was 84 years old, and he was a man of granite and silence. In his final hour, he did not ask for a priest to shrive his soul. He did not ask for his sisters to offer their hollow comforts. He simply set his fountain pen down with the same surgical precision he had applied to every ledger entry for 40 years and waited for the clock to strike midnight. It was a matter of timing, not of tragedy. He had spent 4 decades counting the cost of a name he had never asked for, and tonight the ledger would finally close. The study was a cathedral of meticulous order, where even the shadows seemed to align with the geometry of the shelves. On the mahogany desk, a single document lay open, its pages heavy and thick with the weight of historical consequence. The Stirling restitution was not a will. It was a confession bound in calfskin, a private kingdom of ink and restitution. To the casual observer, the room looked like the office of a wealthy man, but to Arthur it was a counting house of ghosts. He looked at the maritime charts pinned to the walls, maps of shipping lanes that had once been the arteries of the Vane family's absolute power. He remembered the stories his father, Julian Vane, the 10th Duke, used to tell about the family's shipping interests. Julian had not been a businessman. He had been a predator who saw the world as a series of accounts to be drained. Arthur had inherited the wealth, the titles, and the crushing, invisible debt of his father's cruelty. He had spent his life as the silent architect of a different kind of legacy. It was a legacy built on the slow, patient restoration of what had been broken. As the final minutes of his life ticked away, Arthur reached out and touched the edge of the leather-bound book. His fingers were gnarled, the skin like translucent paper over bone, yet his hand did not tremble. He had made sure every legal loophole was sealed, every asset traced and every cent accounted for. He had worked in the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the London peerage and the grasping hands of his own siblings. He knew what they called him: the cold duke, the miser of Stirling, the man who let the family glory rot while he stared at the water. They did not understand that he was not watching the waves for pleasure. He was watching for the return of a debt. The clock on the mantel, a heavy ormolu piece that had belonged to 3 previous dukes, began its rhythmic, metallic chime, 12 strokes. At the final vibration of the bell, Arthur Vane closed his eyes. He did not sigh, he did not struggle. He simply became part of the silence of the house. 3 days later, the silence of Stirling Hall was shattered by the arrival of the Vane sisters. They descended upon the estate like vultures in expensive bombazine, their heels clicking sharply against the cold marble floors of the foyer. The motorcars had barely cooled in the drive before they were already measuring the halls with their eyes. Lady Beatrice, the eldest, led the procession with a spine as rigid as a bayonet. She was a woman who lived for the sterling diamonds and the social currency of her brother's title. Behind her came Lady Clementine, whose eyes were already scanning the antique furniture for the marks of valuation, her mind likely already arranging an auction of the smaller pieces. Lady Prudence, the youngest, trailed behind them, her grief a thin, performative veil over a jagged impatience. To them, Arthur's death was not a loss, it was an opening. It was the moment the long, cold winter of his stewardship would finally give way to the spring of their inheritance. They gathered in the library, a room that smelled of dust, old glue, and the heavy scent of unread history. It was a space designed for contemplation, yet the sisters filled it with the friction of their ambition. Thomas Halloway, the Duke's solicitor, was already there, seated behind a table that looked far too small for the gravity of the papers he held. Mr. Halloway was a man of maritime law, a creature of fine print and ironclad clauses. He did not look up when the sisters entered. He continued to polish his spectacles with a cloth of grey silk, his movements methodical and detached. He had spent the morning arranging the documents with a precision that mirrored the Duke's own habits, ensuring that every page of the binding confession was positioned to deliver its intended weight. He had been the only man Arthur Vane trusted, and in his briefcase lay the instrument of the family's total displacement. Lady Beatrice took the central chair, her silk skirts rustling with an aggressive elegance. She did not ask about her brother's final moments. She did not ask if he had been at peace when the light left him. She simply adjusted her pearls and looked at the solicitor with a gaze that expected immediate obedience. It was a matter of business, not of emotion. She had spent 20 years waiting for Arthur to vacate the seat of power, and she was prepared to claim her due. Lady Clementine sat to her left, her fingers twitching over a reticule that likely contained a list of the estate's primary assets. Lady Prudence stood by the fireplace, her silhouette sharp against the dying embers, her volatile eyes darting between the solicitor and the heavy book on the table. They were hungry for the spoils of a man they had never sought to understand. Mr. Halloway finally replaced his spectacles and looked at the three women. He did not see the granddaughters of a duke, he saw the descendants of a crime. He cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound that seemed to draw the very air out of the room. He did not begin with the standard preamble of family affection or noble lineage. Instead, he pulled the heavy, leather-bound volume toward him. The Sterling Restitution. The book seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its gilded edges catching the dim light of the library. To be a Vane was to be powerful, and to be powerful was to be untouchable. But today, that foundation would crumble. "Your brother was a man of extraordinary foresight," Mr. Halloway began, his voice level and devoid of warmth. He spent the better part of 40 years auditing the history of the Vane family fortune. He believed that a house built on sand cannot stand, but a house built on blood must be dismantled to its very foundations. Consequently, he did not leave a standard will. He left a restitution protocol. Lady Beatrice's brow furrowed, a hairline fracture appearing in her mask of aristocratic poise. Restitution, that is a term for criminals and debtors, Mr. Halloway. Arthur was the Duke of Sterling. Whatever odd hobbies he pursued in his isolation, the law of inheritance is quite clear. The estate, the titles, and the holdings passed to the family. We are the only family he had. "The law is indeed clear, Lady Beatrice," Mr. Halloway replied, his fingers tracing the embossed letters on the cover of the book. "And it is precisely the law that has enabled Arthur to do what he has done. He did not merely manage the estate, he transformed it. He spent 40 years liquidating the Vane family's historical assets, the very assets your father, the 10th Duke, used to dismantle the shipping industry of the Mediterranean coast in the 1950s. The sisters exchanged a glance of sharp, mounting confusion. Lady Prudence stepped forward, her voice rising in a pitch of sudden anxiety. "What are you talking about? Our father was a giant of industry. He built Stirling Hall into the empire it is today. Arthur was supposed to preserve that. He was the steward of our name, not an auditor of our past." "He was the steward of a debt," Mr. Halloway corrected her, his tone turning clinical. "The Sterling Restitution is the final accounting of that debt. Every manor, every acre of land, every diamond in the Sterling collection, and the entirety of the £5 billion liquid trust has been consolidated into a single transfer. The Duke has spent his life ensuring that the Vane family owns nothing of what it stole. He has methodically unwound the thread of your father's greed until there is nothing left to hold." The mention of the £5 billion hit the room like a physical shock, a weight that made the floorboards seem to groan. Lady Clementine gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if to catch her breath, her fingers fumbling with a brooch that was suddenly worth less than the air she breathed. The sheer magnitude of the sum, a fortune she had already spent 1,000 times in her mind, was now being held just out of reach. Lady Beatrice went pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. £5 billion. It was a sum that could buy empires, and yet the solicitor's tone suggested they were merely spectators to its departure. "5 billion?" Lady Clementine whispered, her voice trembling. "Arthur never spoke of such a sum. He lived like a monk in this draughty house. He let the gardens go to seed and the stables remain empty. Where did it come from? It came from the interest of 4 decades of meticulous investment." "Lady Clementine," Mr. Halloway said, "and from the systematic recovery of assets your father had hidden in offshore accounts. It is all here, documented down to the last penny. It was not a fortune to be enjoyed, it was a debt to be repaid." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Lady Beatrice stood, her chair screeching against the floorboards like a wounded animal. Owners of nothing? That is impossible. We are the Vanes. We are the blood of this estate. Who could he possibly have left it to? There is no one else. No cousins, no hidden heirs. We have searched the registries for years to ensure our position was secure. Mr. Halloway opened the first page of the ledger. He did not look at them as he read the name, but the words felt like a physical blow to the room's atmosphere. The entirety of the Sterling estate, including the hall, the titles of ownership, and the restitution funds, is deeded in its absolute entirety to Elena Moretti. The name hung in the air, foreign and jagged against the polished wood of the library. Lady Beatrice's voice was a low hiss. Elena Moretti? Who is this person? I have never heard that name in my life. She is not in the social register. She is not part of the peerage. She is a phantom. This is a scam, Halloway. You have allowed a dying, senile man to be manipulated by a fortune hunter who saw an opportunity in his madness. She is not a phantom, Lady Beatrice, Mr. Halloway said, his voice regaining its rhythmic, authoritative pulse. She is a reality. She is the granddaughter of Lorenzo Moretti, the man whose livelihood and village were destroyed by your father's shipping monopoly in 1952. Your brother did not find a lover or a secret family. He found the person to whom this wealth truly belongs. He spent 40 years tracking the descendants of those your father ruined, and Elena Moretti is the final balance of the account. Lady Clementine began to laugh, a shrill, hysterical sound that lacked any mirth. £5 billion to a fisherman's granddaughter. It is a joke. It is a madman's final insult to his sisters. We will fight this. We will contest every line and every signature. No court in England will allow the transfer of an ancestral dukedom to a woman no one has ever met. You are welcome to try, Mr. Halloway said, closing the ledger with a sound that echoed like a gavel. But you will find that Arthur Vane was not a madman. He was a meticulous accountant of the soul. He has spent 4 decades ensuring this document is airtight. The sterling restitution is not a request, it is a judgment, and Elena Moretti is not coming to settle. She is coming to collect. The sisters stood frozen in the center of the library, the fire in the hearth casting long, distorted shadows behind them. They looked at the heavy book on the table, the dark leather that held the end of their world. The ledger was not a book of numbers, it was a map of 1,000 drowned lives. They had expected a feast, but they had been served a reckoning. In the distance, the sea crashed against the cliffs, a sound that Arthur Vane had listened to every day of his life, waiting for the moment the tide would finally turn. The ledger was balanced, the debt was called, and for the first time in centuries, the Vane family was truly, profoundly alone. Lady Beatrice did not wait for the solicitor to offer a gesture of dismissal. She turned from the library with a predatory swiftness, her silk skirts whipping against the heavy mahogany door like a warning. Behind her, Lady Prudence followed, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps that betrayed a volatility her elder sister had long since mastered. They did not speak as they ascended the grand staircase, their shadows stretching long and thin against the portraits of ancestors who had built their legend on the very foundations Arthur Vane had just dismantled. The air in the upper hallway of Stirling Hall was colder, a stagnant chill that smelled of damp stone, and the faint lingering scent of the lavender oil the maids used to wax the floorboards. To Beatrice, the house was no longer a monument to her lineage, it was a crime scene, and her brother was the primary suspect. They reached the heavy oak doors of the Duke's private quarters, a suite of rooms that had remained a fortress of solitude for 40 years. Lady Beatrice pushed them open with a force that sent a shudder through the brass hinges. The room was exactly as Arthur had left it, austere, meticulous, and devoid of the comforts one expected of a man with his resources. There was no fire in the hearth, only the grey ash of a final, calculated burn. Beatrice did not pause to admire the view of the churning sea from the window. She moved directly to the roll-top desk in the corner, her fingers, clad in black lace gloves, twitching with a cold impatience. She did not seek a memento of a brother she had never loved. She did not seek a lock of hair or a faded photograph of their childhood. She sought a mistake. "Search the wardrobe, Prudence," Beatrice commanded, her voice a low, rhythmic rasp that cut through the silence of the room. "Scan for correspondence. Seek anything that bears a postmark from the Mediterranean. A man does not give away £5 billion without leaving a trail of sentiment. There must be a diary. There must be a record of his madness that a court of law will recognize as senility. Prudence moved with a frantic energy, her hands rifling through the Duke's impeccably pressed suits and heavy wool coats. She worked with a desperate efficiency, the sound of fabric rasping against fabric filling the room like the scratching of 1,000 pens. She did not care for the dignity of the dead. She cared for the solvency of the living. She tore at the linings of pockets and felt along the seams of the heavy bombazine curtains, her eyes darting like trapped birds. Every moment that passed without a discovery felt like a brick being added to the wall that now separated them from their inheritance. Beatrice, meanwhile, had reached the inner drawers of the desk. The locks had been engaged, but she did not possess the Duke's patience. She took a heavy brass letter opener from the blotter, a sharp, tapering blade etched with the Vane family crest, and wedged it into the seam of the central drawer. The wood groaned, a dry, protesting sound that echoed in the vaulted ceiling. With a sharp, sudden crack, the mechanism failed. She pulled the drawer open, expecting the lush, frantic outpourings of a secret diary or the incriminating letters of a hidden mistress. Instead, she found a series of small grey notebooks, each labelled with a year and a maritime coordinate. She opened the one marked 1974. There were no poems, no confessions of longing, and no traces of a man's emotional interior. There were only columns of figures, lists of vessel names, and the meticulous calculation of interest. She flipped through the pages, her frustration mounting as she realized the sheer scale of the order she was confronting. Arthur Vane had not been a man of secrets. He had been a man of systems. He had not hidden his life. He had audited it. Every entry was a record of a payment made to an account labeled simply as the debt. "There is nothing here but mathematics," Beatrice hissed, throwing the notebook onto the desk with a violence that scattered a stack of blotter papers. No diary, no letters, just the endless, rhythmic counting of a man who spent 40 years paying for a ghost. Prudence emerged from the wardrobe, her face pale, and her hair beginning to fray from her frantic efforts. She held a small, leather-bound book she had found hidden in a hollowed-out space behind the cedar lining. Her eyes were wide with a sudden sharp hope. Beatrice, see, it was hidden. This must be it. This must be the proof of his obsession. Beatrice snatched the book from her sister's hand. The leather was worn, the edges softened by decades of handling. She opened it, her heart thudding against her ribs with a cadence that matched the chiming timepiece in the hall. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the ink on the page, but as she read the first few lines, the hope died in her throat, replaced by a cold, leaden realization. It was not a diary of love. It was a diary of wreckage. It contained a list of names. Men who had died in the winter of 1952. Women who had lost their homes. And children whose lives had been stunted by the sterling monopoly. Beside each name was a date and a sum. The secret diary was not a book of confessions. It was a record of convictions. It was the blueprint for the ancestral atonement. It was the evidence that Arthur Vane had not been a victim of a fortune hunter, but the architect of his own family's ruin. He had tracked the Moretti family across 3 generations with the same surgical precision he had used to manage the family's coal mines. He had seen the debt as a physical entity, a weight of stone that he had to move, pebble by pebble, until the ledger was balanced. He wasn't mad, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with a rare, suppressed indignity. He was deliberate. He spent every hour of his life ensuring that we would be the ones to pay for our father's sins. He didn't lose the signet ring, Prudence. He didn't misplace the diamonds. He prepared them for Elena Moretti. He made sure that by the time he died, there wouldn't be a single legal loophole left for us to crawl through. Prudence sank onto the edge of the Duke's narrow bed, her spine finally losing its performative rigidity. Then what do we do? If the will is as airtight as Mr. Halloway says, and if he's been planning this since before we were born, what is left for us? We are the daughters of a duke, Beatrice. We cannot live on the charity of a fisherman's granddaughter. Beatrice looked at the letter opener in her hand, the steel reflecting the grey light of the afternoon. Her face hardened into a mask of granite resolve. We do not live on charity, we find the girl. If Arthur has given her everything, then she is the only thing standing between us and the street. We do not look for a flaw in the will anymore, Prudence. We look for a flaw in Elena Moretti. Everyone has a price and everyone has a secret. We will find hers before she ever sets foot in this hall. While the upper rooms of Sterling Hall were being scoured by the frantic hands of the sisters, the library remained a sanctuary of clinical explanation. Mr. Holloway sat exactly where the sisters had left him, his spectacles once again perched on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed the final liquidation schedules of the Sterling Trust. Across from him, Lady Clementine had returned, her rage replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. She was the most practical of the three, a woman who understood the language of assets better than the language of blood. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the thick, leather-bound volume of the settlement ledger. "You say the funds have already been moved," Clementine said, her voice level and devoid of the hysteria that had gripped her sisters. 4 decades of liquidation. My brother must have been a very busy man to dismantle a £5 billion empire without a single person in the capital noticing the shift in the tides. Mr. Holloway looked up, his expression one of professional detachment. "The Duke did not move the funds in a single noticeable wave, Lady Clementine. He moved them like the tide, constant, rhythmic and imperceptible to those who were not looking at the shoreline. He used a series of specialized maritime trusts, accounts that were linked to the very shipping lanes your father once controlled. He redirected the profits of the Vane holdings into a restitution fund that grew through the sheer power of compound interest and the Duke's own technical mastery of maritime law." He turned the page of the ledger, the paper making a sharp, dry sound that echoed in the silent room. The Sterling restitution was not a document of inheritance. It was a weapon of mass displacement. It was designed to ensure that the wealth could never be clawed back by the family. Every cent that flowed into the Moretti accounts in Italy was documented as a debt repayment, not a gift. In the eyes of the law, the Vane family has been paying its creditors for 40 years. You cannot contest a debt that has already been acknowledged and settled by the head of the house. Clementine leaned forward, her gaze intensifying. "And the Sterling diamonds, they are the soul of our social standing. Surely they are considered family heirlooms, protected by the laws of entailment. Arthur could not possibly have deeded them to a woman who has no claim to our blood." "The diamonds," Mr. Holloway replied, his voice taking on a rhythmic, authoritative pulse, "were not jewels. They were frozen hours of stolen labor. Your brother discovered that they were purchased using the liquidated assets of the Moretti fishing fleet in 1953. Consequently, he had them reappraised and legally reclassified as part of the maritime restitution. They are currently being held in a secure vault in the city, awaiting the arrival of their new owner. Elena Moretti is not merely inheriting a house, she is inheriting the restoration of a stolen history." Clementine felt a cold, hollow sensation in her chest. She realized then that Arthur had not merely been avoiding them, he had been erasing them, he had taken everything they valued. The land, the money, the very jewels on their necks, and redefined them as stolen goods. He had stripped them of their dignity by transforming their inheritance into a moral ledger that only Elena Moretti could balance. It was a matter of action, not of emotion, and the action was already complete. "Where is she, Mr. Holloway?" Clementine asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Where is this woman who has our lives in her reticule? If she is coming to collect, when does she arrive?" Mr. Holloway closed the ledger with a sound that felt like the closing of a tomb. He looked at the clock on the mantel, the rhythmic ticking the only sound in the vast, cold library. "She is already on her way. She does not seek a confrontation, Lady Clementine. She seeks a reckoning. She will arrive at the funeral of your brother, wearing the signet ring he sent to her years ago. She will not come as a guest. She will come as the mistress of Sterling Hall." Clementine stood, her movements methodical and poised, though the blood had drained from her face. She looked around the library, seeing for the first time the dust that had settled on the books and the coldness of the hearth. The house was already dead. They were merely the ghosts who hadn't realized they were being evicted. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking against the stone floor with a sound that mimicked a mechanical metronome. The ledger was balanced, the debt was called, and the silence of the house was now the only inheritance they had left. The state of the ledger was now finalized. The sisters had lost their search for a flaw. finding only a diary of their father's crimes. The legal framework of the late Duke's mandate was revealed to be a fortress of maritime law, and the transition of the family jewels from heirlooms to restitution was complete. The Vane family was no longer the owners of a kingdom, they were the tenants of a ruin, waiting for the woman no one had ever met, Elena Moretti, to walk through the door and claim the keys to their world. The morning at Stirling Hall arrived not with the warmth of a rising sun, but with an oppressive, suffocating grey that seemed to bleed directly from the stone walls. It was the 5th day since Arthur Vane had been found dead in his study, and the house had settled into a state of suspended animation, a clockwork kingdom waiting for its new, unknown sovereign. In the morning room, the air tasted of cold coffee, silver polish, and the sharp, metallic tang of the rain that battered the leaded glass windows. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the table, her spine a straight, uncompromising line of black silk against the velvet upholstery. She did not look at the breakfast that had gone cold on the sideboard. She looked instead at the man sitting across from her, a private specialist from the city, whose eyes were as tired and grey as the morning light. He set a manila folder on the table between them. The sound it made was heavy and final, a dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the china cups. Beatrice did not reach for it immediately. She practiced a silent private art of survival that required absolute stillness until the opponent had revealed their hand. Prudence, standing by the window, was less restrained. Her fingers plucked incessantly at the lace of her cuffs, her shadow jumping against the grey stone as she turned to face the room. They had spent 48 hours and a small fortune to track the ghost of Elena Moretti, and now the paper trail was lying on the mahogany. "It is not a secret family, Lady Beatrice," the specialist began, his voice level and clinical. "We have scoured the birth registries from the Mediterranean to the city. There is no biological link between the late Duke and this woman. We have also found no evidence of a romantic entanglement, no letters, no photographs, no shared residences. What we found instead is a financial hemorrhage that has lasted for exactly 42 years. A methodical, rhythmic transfer of funds that occurred on the first Tuesday of every month, regardless of the state of the economy or the Duke's own health." Beatrice leaned forward, her gaze intensifying until the specialist looked down at his own notes. 42 years. My brother lived like a pauper in this drafty museum so he could send money to a stranger. To what end? Blackmail is usually messy. It is loud and erratic. This sounds like an endowment. It was not an endowment, and it was not blackmail, the specialist replied, sliding a sheet of paper toward her. It was a summary of the accounts. It was a debt. The Duke established a trust in 1982, labeled in the bank records simply as the debt. Every month he transferred a sum that mirrored the precise market value of a merchant shipping fleet, adjusted for inflation and lost interest. The recipient was always a legal entity in the Moretti village. For 40 years, the Duke was not managing an estate. He was paying a self-imposed tax on his own existence. He was liquidating the Vane family's future to restore a past that none of you were ever told existed. Beatrice took the folder. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and authoritative. As she scanned the columns of numbers, she felt a cold, hollow sensation in her chest. The ledger was not a book of numbers. It was a map of her brother's absolute betrayal of his own class. Arthur had not been protecting their legacy. He had been systematically dismantling it, brick by brick, pound by pound. He had lived in silence so that he could hear the sound of the sterling fortune being bled dry. The folder was not a collection of reports. It was a weapon of maritime law, and her brother had been the one to pull the trigger. "The Moretti village," Prudence whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of her suppressed indignity. "I remember that name. It was in the old shipping charts in the attic. Father used to joke about it. He said it was a village that forgot how to fish because they got too greedy. He said the Vane family taught them a lesson in modern economics. The lesson, the specialist said, reaching into his bag for a second, smaller dossier, was a famine, and the Duke knew it. We found these in the maritime archives. They were sealed under a 50-year confidentiality clause that expired last month. It seems your father, Julian Vane, the 10th Duke, didn't just compete with the Moretti village. He destroyed it. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. Beatrice looked at the second dossier. But she did not open it. She did not need to. The technicality of the crime was already written in the grey notebooks she had found in Arthur's desk. The Duke had spent 40 years counting the lives his father had erased, and now the final bill had come due. It was a matter of mathematics, not of emotion. The binding settlement was the final stroke of a pen that had been moving for half a century. By the afternoon, the search for the truth had moved from the drawing room to the bowels of Stirling Hall. Beatrice, followed by Clementine and a shivering Prudence, descended the narrow stone steps to the archive room, a vaulted space beneath the library that smelled of damp earth, iron, and the slow decay of paper. This was where the 10th Duke, Julian Vane, had kept his private files, far from the prying eyes of the solicitors. It was a cathedral of corporate greed, where the shelves were lined with the records of a dozen dismantled industries. Beatrice moved with a methodical, predatory grace, her hand tracing the rusted handles of the filing cabinets. She did not seek comfort. She sought the foundation of the debt. She stopped at a cabinet marked 1950 to 1955. The lock was a heavy, industrial piece of brass, but she had brought the master key she had taken from Arthur's cold fingers. It turned with a sharp, protesting scream of metal. The drawer slid open, releasing a cloud of dust that tasted of ancient soot. Inside, they found the Stirling Monopoly files. They were not hidden. They were archived with a pride that was more chilling than any secret. Beatrice pulled out a thick bundle of documents tied with a rotting silk ribbon. As she laid them out on the scarred wooden table, the sisters crowded around, their breath hitching in the cold air. The documents detailed the systematic destruction of the Moretti fishing fleet. There were contracts for the secret purchase of the docks, orders for the sabotage of the village's canning facilities, and a series of letters between Julian Vane and the local authorities that read like a blueprint for a siege. "He didn't just buy them out," Clementine said, her voice unusually small. "He trapped them. He bought the land they used to dry their nets. He bought the only road that led to the market. He turned a thriving village into a prison in less than 6 months. And look at the profit margins. He made a fortune from the famine he created. He used the ruin of a village to buy the sterling diamonds." Beatrice looked at the final page of the file, a list of signatures. At the bottom, in a bold, arrogant hand, was the signature of Julian Vane. Beside it, in a small, cramped script that showed the first signs of the granite silence to come, was the signature of a young Arthur Vane, then only 21 years old. He had been a witness to the crime. He had seen the signatures. He had heard the silent cries of the villagers across the water, and he had spent the next 60 years trying to erase his own name from the page. The archive room felt like a tomb, the weight of the house above them pressing down like the guilt of 1,000 ancestors. Prudence reached out to touch a map of the coastline, her fingers trembling against the faded blue of the Mediterranean. He knew. Arthur knew the whole time. That's why he never married. That's why he never looked us in the eye. He was waiting for the ghost of the Moretti family to come back for its soul. "The village isn't coming back, Prudence," Beatrice said, her voice returning to its rhythmic, authoritative pulse. "Elena Moretti is, and she isn't coming for an apology. She is coming for the interest. She is coming to take the very roof from our heads, because she knows that every stone of this house was paid for with the lives of her people. The Stirling Monopoly wasn't a business venture. It was an act of war, and Arthur has just surrendered the keys to the kingdom." Beatrice stood, her face a mask of cold, analytical resolve. She looked at the files, seeing them not as history, but as a legal death warrant. She realized that their search for a flaw in Elena Moretti's character was a useless endeavor. Even if the woman was a saint or a sinner, the debt was real. The crime was documented, and the restitution was legally anchored in a way that made their own claims look like the petty thefts of children. The Vane family was not a dynasty. They were a collection of debtors who had finally run out of time. The descent into the archives had provided more than just paper. It had provided a sensory map of their father's cruelty. Beatrice touched the edge of a ledger, noting the meticulous way the 10th Duke had recorded the decrease in the Moretti fishing yields. Each decline in catch was marked with a corresponding increase in the sterling shipping profits. It was a perfect, terrible inverse relationship. Julian Vane had not been a businessman. He had been a predator who understood the mathematics of starvation. Arthur had inherited this ledger, and he had spent 40 years trying to balance it with his own blood. Dictated by the relentless march of time, the sisters remained in the vault for hours, auditing the destruction. They found the records of Lorenzo Moretti, a man whose entire livelihood had been dismantled in a single season. The 10th Duke had not only stolen his boats, he had purchased the debt on his home and foreclosed within a week of the monopoly's completion. It was an unspoken, insular method of endurance for the Vane family, built on the absolute ruin of others. The more Beatrice read, the more she understood why Arthur had chosen Elena Moretti. She was not just a name. She was the living embodiment of the ledger's missing balance. "We have 3 days until the funeral," Beatrice commanded, her voice cutting through the damp silence of the archive. 3 days to prepare for the arrival of a woman who has been counting our mistakes since before she was born. We will not hide, and we will not scream. We will meet her at the chapel, and we will show her that even if we are beggars, we are still of the Vane family. We will dress in our finest black, we will wear the jewels that we still possess, and we will wait for the daughter of the Moretti village to claim her due. The state of the ledger was now beyond dispute. The sisters had found the source of the rot, and in doing so, they had discovered that they were not the victims of a brother's madness, but the beneficiaries of a father's cruelty. The dreaded ledger was no longer a mystery. It was a moral inevitability. As they climbed the stairs back to the main hall, the rhythmic ticking of the great clock seemed to echo the name of the woman who was already crossing the sea to meet them. Elena Moretti. The ghost was no longer in the shadows. She was at the gate, and the keys to Stirling Hall were already in her hand. Beatrice stopped at the top of the stairs, her hand gripping the cold marble banister. She looked toward the front doors, imagining the woman standing there. No one had ever met her, yet she was the most significant person in their lives. The funeral would not be a farewell to Arthur. It would be a welcoming of the dead. The Vane family would stand in the pews, and they would watch as the history they had ignored walked up the aisle to reclaim the world. It was a matter of justice, not of mercy. The silence of Stirling Hall was finally being broken by the approaching footsteps of the Moretti legacy. The day of the funeral dawned with a clarity that was almost offensive, a sharp, crystalline light that exposed every crack in the grey stone of the Stirling Estate chapel. It was not a morning for soft memories. It was a morning of exposure. The chapel, an ancient structure of flint and mortar, was filled with the cloying scent of lilies and the medicinal tang of old wood polish. The London peerage had arrived in force, a sea of black wool and dark silk, their faces neutral but their eyes darting with restless curiosity. They had not come to mourn Arthur Vane. They had come to witness the reading of a debt they had only heard of in whispers. They had come to see the ghost. Lady Beatrice sat in the front pew, her spine as rigid as a bayonet. She was draped in mourning weeds of the finest crepe, her hands clasped tightly over a hymnal. To her left, Lady Clementine scanned the crowd with clinical precision, measuring social standing against the insolvency of their name. Lady Prudence sat on the end, her breath coming in short puffs in the cold air. They were the survivors of a dynasty, and they performed their roles with hollow perfection. They did not weep. They did not falter. They waited for the clock to strike the hour, their internal ledgers already open and bleeding red. Thomas Halloway stood near the altar, a solitary figure in a charcoal suit. He looked at the heavy oak casket that held the remains of Arthur Vane. Resting carefully to the right of the solicitor, upon a small velvet-covered stand, lay the sterling restitution, the leather-bound ledger that had become the most feared document in the county. The peerage watched it as if it were a coiled serpent. They whispered about the £5 billion and the Italian village. They spoke of the woman no one had ever met, the phantom heir who had managed to unseat the Vane family without firing a single shot. The funeral was not a ceremony, it was a public audit. Every movement was an entry in a social ledger, being balanced in real time. The choir began a low, melancholic requiem that vibrated through the stone foundations. Beatrice watched the doors. She did not blink. She expected a fraud or a fortune hunter. She did not understand that the woman who was approaching did not need to shout to be heard. As the music reached a crescendo, the heavy oak doors groaned open. The sound cut through the chapel like a blade. A woman stood in the threshold, framed by the blinding white light of the morning. She was not wearing the black of the peerage. Elena Moretti wore a simple, tailored dress of Mediterranean silk, the color of a deep, sun-drenched sea, a sea blue that matched exactly the shade of the water in the painting Arthur Vane had kept in his study for 40 years. It was a color of presence, not of absence. Elena Moretti did not hesitate. She walked up the center aisle with a methodical, rhythmic pace that echoed the steady pendulum of the great clock in Stirling Hall. She was a woman of quiet competence, her posture defined by a lifetime of labor. Her fingers were not adorned with the diamonds of the Vane family. She carried nothing but a small silver chain around her neck. She was the silent architect of a reclamation, and the chapel fell into a silence so profound that the only sound was the rustle of her silk. She walked past Beatrice, Clementine, and Prudence without a glance. Elena Moretti reached the altar and stopped, her presence a vibrant blue against the sea of black. Thomas Halloway bowed his head, a gesture of recognition that sent a shockwave through the gathered guests. This was the mistress of the ledger. Elena reached for the chain at her neck and pulled it from beneath her collar. Hanging from the silver links was a heavy gold ring, its crest etched into the flat, square face. The sterling signet ring was not a piece of jewelry. It was a sovereign seal. It was the ancestral ring the sisters believed lost in the 1970s. Beatrice stood, her face turning a translucent white. She recognized it instantly. It was the ring their father, Julian Vane, had used to sign the monopoly contracts, and the ring Arthur Vane had taken when he realized the cost of the family name. Seeing it on Elena Moretti was the final proof of the transfer. The ring was the key, and Elena held it with the dignity Arthur had spent 40 years preparing her to carry. Elena did not speak. She simply looked at the sisters, her analytical brown eyes weighing their worth and finding it wanting. She did not need to scream her claim. The ring, the dress, and the silence were her credentials. She turned to the casket and rested her hand on the oak, a private gesture of farewell to the man who had been her distant guardian. In that moment, the power shifted. The Vane family were the ornaments of a dying era, and Elena Moretti was the foundation of the new. The peerage watched as Elena took her seat at the very front alongside Thomas Halloway. She sat with a straight spine, her eyes focused on the service with unshakable grace. She did not look like a woman who had just won a fortune. She looked like a woman who had just taken up a heavy, necessary burden. She did not seek to be seen. She sought to be effective. After the service, the tension moved to the inner sanctum of Stirling Hall. The sisters did not wait for the burial. They retreated to the Duke's study, a room that smelled of old parchment and the sea. They were no longer in control of the narrative. Beatrice paced the oxblood rug, her heels clicking like a countdown. "It is a trick," Prudence hissed. "A ring is just metal." She thinks she can claim the hall because Arthur had a sentimental streak. "We will offer her a settlement, Beatrice. She can return to her village, and she will leave the hall to those who know how to hold it." Beatrice did not answer. She was looking at the desk where Elena Moretti was already standing. Elena had not waited for an invitation. She stood behind the desk, her hand resting on the leather-bound sterling restitution. Positioned deliberately near the ledger sat a sleek laptop, its silver surface a jarring contrast to the dark mahogany of the room. "The time for settlements is over, Lady Beatrice," Elena said, her voice level and devoid of performative emotion. She spoke with a rhythmic pulse that commanded the room. "Arthur Vane did not leave a negotiation. He left a liquidation. I am not here to discuss terms. I am here to execute the restitution." Clementine stepped forward, clutching her pearls. "You have no right. This house has belonged to our blood for centuries. Whatever secret debt Arthur imagined he owed your grandfather Lorenzo Moretti, it does not give you the right to treat us as trespassers." Elena Moretti did not flinch. She reached for the laptop and turned the screen toward the three sisters. "Your brother knew you would say that. He knew the weight of your entitlement would blind you to the reality of the ledger. Consequently, he left something specifically for this moment. He wanted to speak for himself." She pressed a key. The screen flickered to life, showing Arthur Vane in his final hours, pale, granite-faced, and possessed of a terrible clarity. He sat in the same chair Elena stood behind now. He looked directly into the camera, his winter-gray eyes piercing through the digital veil. "My sisters," Arthur's voice began, the sound rich and heavy. "If you are watching this, It means you have met Elena Moretti. It also means you are likely attempting to dismantle the framework I have spent 40 years building. I am here to tell you that the blood of the Vanes is not a crown, it is a stain." Beatrice stood frozen. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the mantelpiece's chimes and the steady voice of the Duke. In the summer of 1952, Arthur continued in a clinical tone, "Our father, Julian Vane, used the power of this dukedom to orchestrate the sterling monopoly. He executed a campaign of economic sabotage that ruined the livelihoods of hundreds of families. I was a witness to that crime. I signed the documents. I watched as the profits were used to buy the very jewels you wear today." He paused, the guilt visible in the tightening of his jaw. "I have spent 4 decades as the silent steward of that crime. Every day, I counted the cost of your privilege. The £5 billion transferred into the debt does not belong to you. It is the interest on a balance that should have been settled 60 years ago." He leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. "I have deeded everything to Elena Moretti, because she is the only one who can be trusted to dismantle what our father built. She is the auditor of our soul. I am leaving you nothing because you have already consumed your share in 60 years of unearned luxury. The ledger is closed, Beatrice. The debt is called. Do not fight her. To fight her is to admit that you value a diamond more than a life." The screen went black. Beatrice looked at Elena Moretti, seeing for the first time the true nature of the woman standing behind the desk. Elena was not a fortune hunter. She was the executioner of a legacy. The signet ring on the chain glowed in the dim light, a symbol of power redefined. The Vane family had been stripped of their moral defense by the voice of their own brother. Elena Moretti stood in the center of the fortress, the keys to the kingdom already turning in her hand. It was a matter of restoration, not of revenge. As the sea crashed against the cliffs outside, the rhythmic pulse of the house seemed to align with the breathing of the woman who was finally home. The authority of that moment had been forged earlier that morning, in the vestry of the Sterling Estate Chapel, a sanctuary of cold limestone and heavy, light-starved oak. It was a room designed to make men feel small, a narrow vault where the lingering scent of ancient frankincense wrestled with the sharper, more modern smell of Thomas Halloway's fountain pen ink. The walls were lined with the tarnished brass plaques of deceased Vanes, silent aristocratic witnesses to a legacy built on salt and hidden suffering. Elena Moretti stood in the very center of the small chamber, her sea blue dress a defiant puncture in the monochromatic gloom. The fabric was a heavy Mediterranean silk, the exact shade of the waters in the painting Arthur Vane had kept in his private quarters for 40 years. She did not pace the worn stone floor. She did not seek the comfort of the high-backed cedar chair. She stood with her hands loosely folded, a portrait of absolute patience that seemed to irritate Lady Beatrice more than any hysterical outburst ever could. Beatrice stood by the narrow stained-glass window, her rapid breath fogging the leaded pane in rhythmic bursts that betrayed her internal storm. Behind her, Lady Prudence leaned against a heavy vestment chest, her long, manicured fingers tracing the carved wood with a nervous, scratching motion that mimicked the swing of the grandfather clock in the hall. They had retreated to this damp vestry following the Requiem Mass, driven by the solicitor's unwavering insistence that the formal authentication of the sterling signet ring be conducted in a neutral space before their final return to the estate. For the sisters, this room felt like a carefully laid trap. For the solicitor, it was a sterile laboratory of legal certainty. Mr. Halloway sat at a small, scarred oak table, his spectacles catching the dim candlelight as he meticulously prepared the necessary affidavits. The signet ring was not merely a piece of jewelry. It was a sovereign seal. It rested on a square of black jeweler's velvet, the heavy gold glowing with a dull, undeniable authority. Mr. Halloway picked it up with a pair of silver tongs, his movements as surgical and precise as a clockmaker's. He focused entirely on the crest, the rampant lion of the Vane family clutching a maritime sextant. To the outside world, it was an enviable heirloom. To the solicitor, it was the master key to a £5 billion lock. "It is a matter of strict verification, not of personal trust," Mr. Halloway said, his voice level and rhythmic, echoing flatly against the bare stone walls. He produced a thick, wax-sealed envelope from his leather briefcase, a document dated 1978. The Duke provided a physical casting of this ring and a detailed metallurgical report decades ago. He knew this day would come, and he left nothing to chance. He broke the crimson wax seal, the sharp crack snapping through the quiet room, and unfolded a faded blueprint of the signet's exact dimensions. He also provided the private cipher etched into the inner band, a microscopic detail known only to him, the maker, and now the estate trust. He turned the ring toward the flickering candlelight, peering through a jeweler's loupe. The silence in the vestry was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of the funeral congregation dispersing outside in the gravel courtyard and the steady, metallic ticking of the clock. Beatrice moved closer, her dark bombazine skirts rustling heavily, her heels clicking sharply on the uneven flagstones. Her cold eyes were fixed on the gold, her mind undoubtedly calculating how many appellate lawyers it would take to argue that the ring had been stolen or surrendered under duress. "The cipher matches perfectly," Holloway continued, his voice entirely devoid of performative triumph, "and the metallurgical signature is identical to the records in the Sterling Reserve. This is the original signet, Lady Beatrice. It was never lost in a boating accident, as you were told. It was merely relocated to the person the Duke deemed its rightful custodian." He then turned his focused attention to a stack of foreign documents, their edges yellowed, the paper still carrying the faint, unmistakable smell of sea salt. These were the birth records and maritime registries salvaged from the ruins of the Moretti village. He laid them out across the scarred table with a precision that mirrored Elena's own unshakable stillness. He pointed a steady finger to a baptismal certificate from 1954, the blue ink faded but the names glaringly clear. Beside it, he placed the maritime notebooks, those grey, cloth-bound volumes where Arthur Vane had spent his life recording every diverted shipment and every cent redirected toward the restitution of the Moretti line. Elena Moretti, granddaughter of Lorenzo Moretti. Mr. Holloway read, his finger tracking the lineage across the fragile parchment. "We have cross-referenced these civil documents with the private investigator's findings and the Duke's own exhaustive genealogical research. The identity is fully authenticated. Elena is the sole surviving heir of the Moretti line, the very line Julian Vane systematically attempted to erase from the map in 1952. As a result, the legal criteria for the Sterling restitution have been met in full. There is no room for ambiguity." Beatrice's voice was a low, jagged hiss that barely concealed her rising panic. "Authenticated? By a solicitor who was paid by a man sinking into his dotage. This is an internal family matter, Mr. Holloway. This woman is a complete stranger. She has no claim to the blood of the Vane ancestors. The ring is a trinket. The records are scraps of paper from a forgotten foreign village. You cannot expect us to stand by while the entire history of this county is handed over to a commoner because of some ancient maritime grudge." She did not cry. She did not scream. Instead, Beatrice moved toward Elena, her black crepe skirts dragging across the stone with a venomous elegance. Beatrice was a woman who had always believed that social standing was an impenetrable physical armor. She looked down at Elena, her gaze a weapon honed by decades of refined cruelty. "How much?" Beatrice asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "How much to take your stolen ring and your forged records and disappear? My brother was a man of guilt and shadows. He found a sympathetic, manipulative ear in you, no doubt. But Sterling Hall is not a prize to be handed to a fisherman's granddaughter. It is an aristocratic responsibility. Name a sum that will allow you to live in luxury in your little village, and we will consider this unfortunate matter permanently settled." Elena Moretti finally looked up. Her dark brown eyes were the eyes of an auditor who had already balanced the account and found the opposing party entirely insolvent. She did not look at Beatrice's heavy pearls or the fine cut of her mourning silk. She looked at the woman's rigid posture and saw only the desperate fragility of a crumbling foundation. "The sum has already been named, Lady Beatrice," Elena said. Her voice possessed of a quiet, authoritative pulse that would refuse to be rushed. "It was £5 billion, plus decades of compounded interest, plus the complete surrender of the Sterling legacy. It is not a matter of my personal price. It is a matter of your father's unpaid debt. Your brother spent 40 years carefully counting the cost of your unearned survival. I am not here to negotiate the market value of a country house. I am here to witness the final payment of a generational crime." She reached out with steady, ink-stained fingers and took the heavy gold signet ring from the velvet cloth. She threaded it back onto the silver chain around her neck and tucked it securely beneath the collar of her sea-blue dress. The ring was not a piece of jewelry. It was a binding contract. She looked at Mr. Halloway and gave a single, methodical nod. The authentication was complete. The ghost of the Moretti village was now a legal reality. As they left the vestry and walked the gravel path back to the hall, the silence between the women was as thick as the morning mist rolling off the sea. Beatrice led the way, but the fierce rigidity of her spine was now the brittle rigidity of a corpse. She still believed she could fight. She did not yet realize that her ancestral fortress was already being dismantled from the inside, one signature at a time. Now, back in the Duke's sprawling study, the truth of that morning's authentication hung heavily over the hologny desk, compounded by the devastation of the video confession that had just played. Beatrice's hands trembled violently as they gripped the edge of the polished wood, her fingers digging in until her knuckles turned a bloodless white. The silence in the room was absolute, a physical weight pressing the sisters into the floorboards. Elena Moretti did not wait for them to recover their breath. She stood firmly behind the desk, her fingers resting lightly on the heavy, leather-bound volume of the dreaded dossier. She was no longer a mysterious guest awaiting a formal introduction. She was the architect of the estate's final audit. The papers Elena now pulled from the ledger were the physical blows designed to follow the moral devastation. She laid them out with a clinical detachment, each sheet of thick parchment representing a fractured pillar of the sisters' fortress. Lady Clementine moved closer, her eyes scanning the documents with the frantic, terrified precision of a trapped bird. She saw the embossed seals of national heritage organizations, the emblem of the County Health Board, and the heavy stamp of the Maritime Restitution Authority. "The sterling restitution is not merely a transfer of wealth," Elena began, her voice measured perfectly by the heavy swinging pendulum in the corner. "It is a strict protocol of liquidation. Your brother spent the last 4 decades of his life ensuring that this estate would never again stand as a monument to a single family's greed. He laid the groundwork meticulously, and I have spent the last 3 days auditing the transition." She slid the first document across the desk, the heavy paper hissing against the polished mahogany. "This is the preliminary declaration of intent for the Sterling Library and the South Wing. They are currently being legally reclassified under a charitable trust." Beatrice stared at the document as if it were a venomous serpent. "A charitable trust," she breathed, the words barely escaping her tight throat. "You are stripping our home piece by piece. This is madness. This hall has been the seat of the Sterling dukedom since the 18th century. You cannot simply file paperwork and erase centuries of history. It is not an erasure." "Lady Beatrice," Elena replied, her voice sharpening with a cold analytical edge. "It is a restitution. The massive wealth that built these wings was extracted from the labor of men who died in 1952. It is only fitting that the foundation is audited and prepared for public service rather than private vanity. The transition process has formally begun." Lady Prudence let out a sharp, breathless laugh, her aristocratic composure fraying visibly at the edges. "A public trust," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch. "You want to turn our private estate into a monument for a maritime grudge. What of our residents, Elena? Or did Arthur decide we are merely squatters in our own ancestral halls, waiting to be cast out into the cold?" Elena looked at Prudence with a steady gaze that was neither cruel nor pitying. It was merely a matter of action, not of emotion. "Your personal residence in the hall is currently under review by Mr. Halloway," Elena said calmly. "We are mapping the exact boundaries of what is legally required to house the remaining Vane family members during the dissolution. The Duke left explicit instructions regarding your immediate allowances, but they are entirely contingent upon your cooperation with the estate's restructuring." She pulled a final, sealed envelope from the ledger, tapping it once against the desk with a sound that demanded absolute attention. "The sterling diamonds, however, are not under review. They are a separate mathematical equation entirely, and they have been officially secured and appraised." "The sterling diamonds," Clementine whispered, her voice failing her completely. She took a staggering step back, her shoulder hitting the heavy bookshelf behind her. "You are touching the family jewels. You are going to take the diamonds." "They were never family jewels," Elena said, her voice taking on a final rhythmic pulse. "They were the interest on the famine Julian Vane created. They have been secured as collateral against the original debt owed to the Moretti village. Every diamond will eventually balance a ledger of grief. Every emerald will pay for a fraction of the survival your father denied my people. You cannot wear them, Lady Clementine. They are no longer adornments. They are reparations." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Elena Moretti simply closed the sterling's restitution with a solid, echoing thud that sounded like the closing of a heavy vault door. She smoothed the Mediterranean silk of her dress and walked purposefully toward the tall, mullioned window. Outside, the grey sea was churning violently against the rugged cliffs, the same ancient sea that had watched the Moretti village fall and the Vane family rise. The sisters stood frozen in the lengthening shadows of the study, paralyzed by the realization that their entire reality was being rewritten by a woman they had only just met. The battle lines were no longer drawn with bloodlines or titles, but with ink, arithmetic, and cold, undeniable truth. Elena looked out at the churning water, the heavy gold signet ring resting securely against her chest. The tide of the sterling legacy was turning, and the quiet private art of survival was finally becoming a public reckoning. 4 weeks had passed since the Requiem Mass, a month of cold legal skirmishes and hollow threats that had finally bled into this final grey morning. The transition from a grieving house to a site of administrative liquidation had been measured not by tears, but by the relentless chiming of the grandfather clock in the gallery and the rhythmic scratching of pens against high-bond parchment. Lady Beatrice did not move from her position by the mullioned window, her silhouette a jagged, dark fracture against the churning Mediterranean silk of the sea, visible through the glass. The silence of the study was no longer the respectful hush of a mourning period. It was the sterile, suffocating quiet of an operating theatre where a dying dynasty was being meticulously dissected. Elena Moretti stood behind the heavy mahogany desk of the late Arthur Vane, her presence anchored by the leather-bound volume of the sterling restitution. She did not reach for a handkerchief to blot the cold perspiration of nerves, for there were none. She did not look for the comfort of a chair. She stood with the unshakable stillness of a lighthouse, while the sisters of the late Duke circled her like scavengers caught in a sudden, freezing tide. They had spent the last 30 days attempting to barricade themselves in the West Wing, firing off desperate injunctions and calling in favors from a peerage that had already begun to turn its collective back on the scent of insolvency. Beatrice turned slowly, her black bombazine skirts rustling with a sharp, dry sound that mimicked the scratching of a pen on old parchment. The month of legal stalling had clearly taken its toll. Her face was a mask of strained elegance, the skin pulled tight over cheekbones that seemed sharper than they had been at the funeral. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored vellum, a document prepared in secret by the Vane family's London solicitors over the last 48 hours. She laid it on the desk with a gesture that attempted to reclaim her stolen authority, her fingers trembling only slightly. It was a matter of social preservation, not of legal logic, and Beatrice still believed that even the most meticulous ledger could be balanced with a well-placed bribe. "We have spent the last 4 weeks auditing the liquid assets Arthur so carelessly redirected, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice regaining a rhythmic, authoritative pulse that refused to acknowledge the reality of her eviction. "And we have decided to be pragmatic. We are prepared to offer you a sum that would make you the wealthiest woman in your Mediterranean village for 10 lifetimes. £500 million, paid in a single, untraceable wave from our private offshore holdings. In exchange, you will surrender the signet ring. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the so-called monopoly of 1952, and you will vacate Sterling Hall by sunset. It is a generous exit for a woman of your station." Elena Moretti did not reach for the paper. She did not even look at the sum written in bold, arrogant ink. She looked instead at Beatrice's eyes and saw the desperate fragility of a woman who thought the world was a market play where even a century of guilt could be purchased. Elena's hand remained resting on the calfskin cover of the massive ledger, her fingers steady. She practiced the quiet, observant patience her grandfather, Lorenzo Moretti, had taught her, a survival that required one to count the opponent's mistakes before making a single move. "The settlement was never yours to offer, Lady Beatrice," Elena replied, her voice level and devoid of the performative emotion the sisters so frequently weaponized. "And the sum is not yours to give. Every pound you have just mentioned is already legally categorized as part of the maritime restitution. To offer me that money is like a thief offering a victim the very watch he has just stolen. It is an exercise in futility, not in generosity. You have spent the last month living on credit and borrowed time, but the credit has expired." She opened the ledger to a section marked with a heavy industrial brass clip. The paper hissed as she turned it, the sound sharp in the cold room. "Arthur Vane did not leave me a fortune to negotiate. He left me a liquidation protocol. And that protocol has already been activated during the weeks you spent hiding in the West Wing. While you were preparing this settlement, I was finalizing the physical reclassification of this estate. Sterling Hall is no longer a residence. It is no longer a seat of power. As of 10 o'clock this morning, the deed has been legally transferred to the National Maritime Restitution Trust." Lady Clementine let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hand flying to the pearls at her throat, as if they were a lifeline. "Reclassified? You are turning our home into a museum? You are going to let the public tramp through the halls where our father built his empire?" "It is not merely a museum, Lady Clementine," Elena said, her voice taking on the rhythmic, authoritative pulse of a woman who had already won the war. "The North and West Wings are currently being measured for hospital beds. It is to become the Sterling Memorial Hospital. It will be a specialized facility for the treatment of respiratory diseases, the very ailments that decimated the Moretti village during the famine your father, Julian Vane, orchestrated through his shipping monopoly. The library will remain, but it will be a public archive of maritime history, documenting the truth of the 1950s. The hall is not being erased. It is being repurposed to pay the interest on the lives your family consumed." Beatrice's face turned a translucent white, the skin stretching tight. The realization that her ancestral home was being transformed into a monument to her family's shame was a blow that no amount of money could soften. She looked around the study, seeing the oxblood leather chairs and the heavy mahogany shelves not as her birthright, but as the assets of a hospital ward. The house was not a castle, it was a debt, and the debt was finally being called. "You are a monster," Prudence hissed, her voice cracking with the strain of her suppressed indignity. "You come here with your sea blue dress and your Italian name, and you tear down dynasty because of a business deal that happened before we were born. You think you are a hero of justice, but you are merely a scavenger picking at the bones of a great name." "I did not choose this role, Lady Prudence," Elena said, her gaze shifting to the youngest sister with a clinical detachment. "Arthur Vane chose it for me. He spent 40 years looking for someone with the technical competence to dismantle this house without flinching. He chose me because he knew I would not be swayed by the greatness of your name. He knew I understood that a name is only as heavy as the blood it was built upon. Measured by the ticking of the clock, your time in this house has reached its final second." Elena picked up a heavy industrial brass key from the desk, the archive master key. She held it out toward the door, her movement methodical and poised. "Mr. Halloway is waiting in the foyer with the final eviction notices and the transport for your personal effects. You are permitted to take your clothing and your private correspondence. Everything else, the furniture, the art, and the historic collections, remains with the trust. The Sterling legacy is officially closed." The transition from the study to the foyer was a descent into a cold, clinical reality. The Vane sisters moved with a mechanical stiffness, their heels clicking sharply on the marble floors that they no longer owned. The house felt different already. The air was no longer heavy with the arrogance of the peerage, but with the sharp, clean scent of the salt air and the impending change. In the foyer, Thomas Halloway stood with a group of men in charcoal suits, appraisers and security officers who moved with the quiet efficiency of men clearing a site for a new foundation. On the central marble table, a series of velvet-lined boxes lay open. Inside, the sterling diamonds caught the sharp morning light. their facets throwing jagged, brilliant sparks against the cold stone walls. They were a massive collection of heirloom jewelry, a kingdom of light that had defined the sisters' social standing for decades. But today, they did not look like ornaments. They looked like evidence. "The appraisal is complete," Mr. Halloway said, his voice level and rhythmic as he looked at the sisters. "The sterling diamonds have been valued at £480 million. They will be auctioned in the city next month. The proceeds are already legally bound to the Moretti Village Infrastructure Fund. They are not being sold for profit. They are being sold for reparation." This was the final step of the sterling restitution. Clementine reached out as if to touch a heavy emerald necklace, but she stopped, her hand hovering in the cold air. The jewels were no longer hers. They were no longer part of the Vane story. The sterling diamonds were not jewels. They were the crystallized remains of 1,000 stolen hours. They were the interest on a debt that had been compounding in the dark for 60 years. "Your carriages are waiting in the drive," Elena said, standing at the foot of the grand staircase. She did not look like a conqueror. She looked like a steward who had finally finished a long, grueling audit. "Your trunks have been packed and inspected. You will be provided with a modest stipend from the Duke's private non-maritime savings, enough to live in quiet dignity, provided you understand that your role in the public eye is over. The name of Vane is no longer a currency." Beatrice did not look at Elena as she walked toward the heavy front doors. She kept her head high, her spine a straight, uncompromising line of black silk, but the fierce rigidity of her posture was now the brittle rigidity of a hollowed-out tree. Behind her, Clementine and Prudence followed, their shadows stretching long and thin across the marble foyer for the last time. They walked out into the sharp, crystalline light of the morning, their heels crunching on the gravel drive with a sound that signaled the end of an era. Elena Moretti stood in the open doorway, watching as the black motorcars pulled away, their engines a low, retreating hum against the sound of the crashing sea. She did not feel a sense of triumph. She felt only a profound, expansive sense of relief. The weight of the sterling legacy had been moved, stone by stone, until the ground was finally clear. She looked back at the foyer, seeing the appraisers begin to tag the furniture, the house already transforming into its new, useful life. She walked out onto the rugged coastal cliffs, the wind whipping her sea-blue dress around her legs. The air tasted of salt and freedom. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. It was filled with the dry, red soil of the Moretti village. The earth that had been scorched by the famine her grandfather had survived. She held the soil in her palm for a moment, feeling its grit against her skin. Elena Moretti looked out at the churning sea, the same water that connected her home to this cold, grey estate. She opened her hand and let the wind take the soil, casting it out over the cliffs and into the English wind. It was a silent, private gesture of restoration. The ledger of their lives was finally in perfect balance. The debt was paid, the ghosts were quiet, and for the first time in a century, the history of Stirling Hall was no longer a secret. She reached up and touched the heavy gold signet ring on the chain around her neck. It was cold against her skin, a final anchor to the man who had given her the keys to his own destruction. She would wear it not as a title, but as a reminder of her family's unspoken resilience. The clock in the chapel tower struck the hour, its rhythmic, metallic chime echoing across the cliffs. It was a new horizon, measured by the truth, not by the ledger. Elena Moretti turned back toward the house, her spine straight and her mind already focused on the work of the restoration. It was, finally, home.